I am Augusta DeLomo here with my colleague Brian Franklin. Today is October 29th, 2023, and we are in New York City. We are interviewing Bob Hannigan. Bob, will you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I was an undergraduate at Cornell University and graduated in 1971. I'm here at this conference because Walter LaFeber was my undergraduate advisor and sort of role model, I guess. So.
Can you tell us about the first time you met Walt LaFeber?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I remember exactly. When I was a freshman, Cornell had this survey class that was divided, I think, into at least quarters over the course of an academic year. He may have been one of the teachers of one segment of that, I'm not sure. But he really came on my radar when I got to know the TA in that class, who was a graduate student with Walt. And toward the end of the year, I'd written a paper that the TA liked a lot, and I guess had shown to Walt, and the TA said he'd love to talk to you about the paper, and I was thrilled. So, I followed that up. I don't remember exactly when or how, but I followed that up, and then the following year took his survey class, and really, it changed what major I was going to go into and my life.
Can you talk a little bit about the experience of being in his undergraduate courses?
Yeah, I think almost everyone recognized that they were in the presence of somebody who was just an extraordinarily riveting lecturer. For me, I went to Cornell, somebody of a fairly suburban conservative background and Republican family. And the TA that I had my freshman year, who was one of Walt's graduate students, sort of opened my mind to the thought that maybe I didn't know all there was to know about the world. So I looked forward to Walt's class to take further, an understanding of things. And I found it to be extremely illuminating and stimulating, and even read, books by him especially that weren't assigned in the class. And combined with the fact that this was the period of the Vietnam War, just sort of really had a huge impact on my trying to understand what was going on. I'd come to Cornell with the idea that I would probably be a government major and go on to law school and go into politics, and probably as a Republican. And my life went in quite a different direction. So.
Do you remember what that paper was about that your TA showed to him?
Yeah, I think it was a review. I think it was a review of Gabriel Coco's book, Triumph of Conservatism. I'm pretty sure that's what it was.
And so he becomes your undergraduate advisor. Did
Right.
you work on a thesis with him, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, I'd work on an honors thesis with him my last year there on the U.S. and Japan during the occupation of Japan. And he was very helpful, and it was a very, very good experience. I remember, some amusing aspects of it because one thing that was expected and that I wanted to do was, some primary research that wasn't necessarily all going to take place on the Cornell campus. So I decided I would go to Norfolk, Virginia, to the MacArthur archives that were down there, Douglas MacArthur archives. And so I think Walt got a little nervous as to whether I knew what I was doing, because Norfolk, at least back then, probably in the location of this place, is kind of a rough part of town, So I remember he sort of sized me up and thought maybe this guy needs a little guidance, and we selected a hotel that might be close to the place that I could stay at. I don't think either of us were prepared for what it turned out to be. I remember walking into this hotel and noticing that all the windows were barred, and going into my room and having never experienced a hotel where all the mattresses were covered in plastic. So anyway, I survived a couple of days down there, and I did some research that was useful to my thesis, but I got a kick out of the whole experience, and it was good for me.
So after you finish up at Cornell, where do you go next?
So I went to Princeton for graduate school in history. First year I was there, I wasn't all that thrilled, and I remember writing Walt in the middle of the year and saying, I'm not finding the place as stimulating as I'd hoped it would be, and any chance I could come back to Cornell, and he was perfectly happy to have me do that. It was too late in the year for me to get money for the next year, and he sort of also said, it still might be good for you to get, a different flavoring of other people that you might find there at Princeton, and he was right. So I decided to stay, and it turned out to be, from an intellectual standpoint, a very worthwhile decision that I made. Princeton was a stuffier place than Cornell had been, but I met a lot of graduate students in my cohort that I learned a great deal from, and I got to know some of the professors who I learned immense amounts from. So, it turned out to be a worthwhile endeavor. And I stayed in touch with Walt throughout then and for years afterwards. So.
How did your relationship with him evolve as you went from undergraduate advisee to graduate student to faculty member?
Yeah, well, we stayed in touch, but fairly sporadically, I would say probably through the 80s, 1980s. I took a long time, I got a job up in Boston, and I got it before I finished my thesis. Proved to put me in a vulnerable position when the job was, when the state had a big cutback. This was at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and they had a big cutback, and I was, because I hadn't finished until later, I was sort of down the pecking order in terms of whose job was vulnerable. The position was riffed or cut, and so anyway, I stayed in the Boston area, and for lots of good reasons, and turned out to be a perfectly wise decision. But I also took a long time turning that dissertation into a book, and I felt very defensive about it, but I was also trying to juggle for a long time part-time teaching positions and things to make the career work there, because my wife had already set down roots in the Boston area as well, and we both really liked Boston. So anyway, it did work out, and I did see him sporadically in the 80s and 90s, but I think, I didn't feel totally comfortable, getting back into regular touch with him until I finished that first book. I felt, I know how, Walt, and I respected this, he was, believed in getting things done, and it took me a while to do that. Getting the first book done proved to be kind of breaking a logjam for me, and from then on, I found myself a lot more. That writing came easily, and in any event, so from around the year 2000 or so, I became I got into fairly regular contact with him, especially in the summertime. I would always take a drive out and visit with him in Ithaca, and then once my wife had retired, I had to, because I was an academic, I had more flexibility in the summertime, but once my wife had retired, we both would go out and visit with Walt and Sandy. And those were very memorable occasions because, he and I would stay up till all hours talking about the field. and it was a real treat doing that. So.
Can you talk to us a little bit about how you interacted with his work over the years, whether it's his intellectual production, his teaching, how he took about mentoring students?
Yeah, well, Walt was always there for students, and incredibly selfless in that regard. In fact, when we were traveling around with my son when he was looking for college, Walt showed him around Cornell. And so, he was that kind of person. And likewise, if I had questions about my work or whatever, he was, always willing to be a sounding board for it. Whether it was by email or in a summer meeting or whatever. Also, he would call me, for a footnote or something that he was looking for. I would say in terms intellectually, the basic framework that he laid out for me as an undergraduate was a starting point that, I continued to research and investigate. I think over the course of many years, I stayed broadly within the framework or tradition that Walt was working in, particularly in terms of taking a critical perspective on the history of American foreign relations. But I think also, we didn't agree on everything, and that was fine by me and fine by him. And that was what was remarkable about Walt, was that he was always eager to hear new ideas and have things tried out, and he would give you fairly honest reactions to what you'd done or what he read that you'd done, and vice versa. So.
Do you have any strong memories of things where you disagreed and had a lively conversation about it that you can
Well, I think it was with regard to the first book. I was laying out a thesis that suggested that what American policymakers were trying to do in the early 20th century ideally was to create order in the world so that they could enjoy that order from the standpoint of their interests. And Walt had just revisited that period with this book that he'd written and that I actually talked about here at the conference yesterday, called The Search for Opportunity. And he said, well, they didn't get order. And we agreed they didn't get it. But it was an interesting sort of back and forth because, I said, I totally agree with you that, that we didn't get it, and by the same token, I think that line of thought that he took up in that more recent book called The Search for Opportunity is one that, that I took to heart and, that I've recommended to other people that they take to heart too, that whatever American policymakers thought they were doing, quite often it was the opposite in terms of what the result was. And Walt's point, well taken, is that quite often, while they may have thought of themselves as creating a more orderly world, they were in fact destabilizing other societies. And I totally agree with that. But it was an interesting thing because I was coming at it from a different perspective.
You mentioned later in life having late night conversations with him talking about the field, and
right.
I would love to hear how you think about his contribution to the field and what you think he saw as his contribution to the field of U.S. foreign relations.
Well, he was an extremely self-deprecating person, so it was very hard it would have been impossible to, get an honest reaction from him. But what a number of us have realized as we put together our essays for the Festschrift that we've been working on is that while we always had a very high regard for his scholarship, the task of writing about whatever book or books we did for this project led us to appreciate even more the richness and fertility of his mind. And I think it really was quite interesting, and also I've always been struck, but I am more than ever struck by how mature he was at an early age as an historian. I mean, he made a mark on the profession before he was even 30 years old, which is really rare, winning the American History Association's Beveridge Prize. I think he was 29 when he won that. So I think, as an undergraduate, we thought of him as this mature, which he was. We never sort of stopped to think about the fact that he, really wasn't that much older than we were. But he certainly was a brilliant guy, and in many, many ways, had come to grips with things career-wise as well as intellectually that were useful for us to hear. I think I'm not alone among his students for going off in directions that veered to some extent within again, certain parameters that were still within this broader tradition, but that nevertheless were different than the things that he'd explored. And he was always, curious about that. Sometimes, would, I think, raise eyebrows about things that were going on in the field, but was open to being convinced too. And he was somebody who had, I think, a remarkable capability of growth right through his profession. He wasn't somebody who had like a one-note thing that he insisted everybody come back to and adhere to. And I think that's also something that's been revealed here at the conference, is that he was not the kind of professor who turned out and wanted to turn out people who were like carbon copies of himself, rubber stamp of himself. He was, above all, trying to get people to think about things, and respond to puzzles that they ran into in their work, be it if they were going to history or anything else that they would think for themselves about and have good sort of critical perspective on. So,
you mentioned the maturity of his thinking at an early age, and after reading through the volume, I was just struck by the diversity of things that he wrote on. Geographies, times.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you see as the themes that undergird all of them, and the intellectual questions that you saw him returning back to even as he took all of these different approaches.
Right, yeah. Well, I think, and it's come into sharper perspective doing the conference here. I think that early on, his great concerns were coming out of a concern, which I think was legitimate, with how the growing role the United States was taking in the world had a capacity and threatened to have severely negative consequences for American society and for the future of the United States and the American Republic. And what I saw over the course of his career is an outwardly expanding viewpoint that increasingly also took into consideration, as I was saying earlier, the negative impact frequently of American intervention in other parts of the world on other countries as well. And so that became certainly as important a concern to him as the earlier one had been. So, yeah, I think there is this kind of recurring set of themes, despite the fact that that he took them up in different contexts and different specific topics.
You mentioned his growth over time as a scholar and the integration of different approaches, the Michael Jordan book, and the field of diplomatic history has changed a lot.
Right.
And could you talk to us a little bit about how you think either he saw those changes or what he would have thought about the changes that the field is still undergoing as it becomes more U.S. in the world?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think I think he looked at changes initially from the standpoint of let me see about that sort of thing, And what I noticed over the years was that, in the first chapter of my first book, he said to me, he says, I liked and appreciated what you did with the concept of gender in that chapter. I'm not sure I buy into it in every instance that I've seen it dealt with. Or likewise in terms of this call for multinational or transnational approaches. He worried, I think, that sometimes what these would do would be to exculpate the United States from responsibilities that it needed to fess up to if everything was seen as a response to somebody else rather than reflecting the enormous exceptional power that the United States had. So, yeah, I think over time he assimilated things that made sense to him, and sort of was skeptical of things that he didn't feel had fully convinced him in terms of necessarily their utility, at least to addressing what he saw as pressing problems. I think another interesting example is, and I'm not sure that I remember talking to him about this, but certainly it's there in his work. He, as I put in, there's a chapter that Susan Brewer and I wrote for the Festschrift, and we put in that chapter that, he wasn't going to apologize for studying, quotes, old white men if they had enormous amount of power, and as we put parenthetically, also if they left behind all sorts of notes as to what they were thinking. Not because, he applauded the power they had, but if they were people of exceptional power, it was important for us to know what they were up to and why they thought they were doing what they were. So in that sense, he would defend some of the traditional preoccupations of, quotes, diplomatic history, and I think on valid grounds. So.
We've talked to people who have described the variety of roles that he took on as a teacher, as a mentor, as a scholar, and that, with all of them, he had his own approach. And I'm curious what you would say, do you think he saw as his most important roles?
Yeah, I think it was as a teacher. He clearly loved teaching and was a natural at it. I don't know if it's anything different nowadays, but when I went to graduate school, nobody thought about teaching you how to teach. So fortunately, I had a role model to fall back on, and I think it was a good one. It was one that I developed over time. I don't think Walt ever used PowerPoint slides or things like that, and just formal lectures like he would give to large numbers of students became less and less something that either the students or faculty, thought were the best, from an educational standpoint. But, at the beginning of my career, remember when I was in my first teaching job, I would go in and do exactly what I'd seen him do, which was to put an outline on the blackboard. And I remember this new guy was hired. I was there. I'd already been there for a year or two, and he had his class right at the period after mine. And he came in and he looked at the board and he said, "Did you go to Cornell?" And he says, "Did you have LaFeber's class?" I thought that was hilarious because he'd done the same thing. So I think he thought teaching was a real his calling, and I think he thought of it as something that involved not just conveying information, but trying to sort of empower students to think about things and to be prepared themselves to, critically digest information they were taking in and make sense of it and act on it. So I think it dovetails with his broader concerns about civic life and citizenship and and things like that. I think he was realistic about that was not necessarily going to change the world. But I remember him saying to me once, he says, well, what else are we going to do? And he was not the kind of person who was going to tell somebody how to think.
Some of the participants have noted that he would not have enjoyed being labeled a scholar activist, but some have said that would apply to him. And I'm curious where you fall on it and how you think about him as a public intellectual.
Yeah. Well, the way that some of my colleagues have used that term, I think, is an appropriate way. He was not somebody who on campus was going to join other students shutting an administration building down. And I agree with him in this regard too. Back in the 60s, when I was an undergraduate, the campus was kind of an easy target. The bigger challenges were to take on the world beyond the campus, and mostly that involved, trying to reach people. And I remember him telling me, one of his graduate students, who I don't think ever finished, was very activist on campus, and also used very kind of feverish rhetoric. And Walt said, I told him if he spoke to the cafeteria people or the custodians or the rest of the staff in ways that were more, relatable to them, that he was going to get a lot farther than, just sort of railing at them. So he wasn't somebody who was by any means an activist like that. But he was, certainly while I was there, on several occasions, anxious to talk to students about some crisis that was occurring and try to shed his light on it. And I remember, I think it was when Nixon invaded Cambodia that he did that. Clearly over time, even though I think he may have come to Cornell with this model of a detached scholar, clearly over time, I think he did see himself as somebody who could weigh in on issues. I've been told that during the Central American intervention period of the 80s, when all this activity was going on there, and he wrote this book, Inevitable Revolutions, which itself was intended to be an intervention, to get people to think about what was going on there. He also came and spoke to peace groups and things like that, and in different parts of New York State, at least. I know that he did that. So yeah, I think that's a perfectly acceptable, as long as it isn't, a label that equates with, shutting the building down or something like that.
You mentioned Inevitable Revolutions. Which of his works do you feel like has influenced you the most or stuck with you the most?
Well, they all have. But perhaps The New Empire, which is actually the one that I was involved in, Susan was involved with in this chapter that we collaborated on. I think it was the first book of his that he wouldn't assign his own books, except like if they were a reader, had documents in them, but that was his first book, and, was laying out this very broad thesis that to this day, I think, again, there are ways in which I would revise the thesis, quibble with certain things, but the basic problems that he sets out there have in many ways been sort of issues and problems that I continued to deal with. And actually, the two books that I've written so far, in some ways, constitute extensions time-wise into the early 20th century of some of the things that he was talking about there, although again, conceptually slightly, I think, different, as I thought that they might be conceptualized in a way, and I don't think he ever thought that I was wrong to go in that direction. And I think that the relevance of The New Empire, again, sort of thought about in the broadest possible way, continues right through to the present. And I may have actually been more of that opinion than he was. So I remember having discussions with him about it. So that book probably, but I got a lot out of all of them. And doing this project, it got me to go back and I'm working on a book where that was also called for with some of his other books, and to appreciate books of his I'd read before that I now think more about than I did at the time. One of the problems is that when I read something that Walt had written, he would be so, and so I remember this one book, I think it was the last book that he wrote, The Deadly Bet. I was reading it and I mentioned to him that I was reading it at the time. And he says, well, you don't have to bother with that. And, I looked through it and I thought, well, if he doesn't care about it, maybe. Anyway, Richard Immerman got that book as the chapter that he wrote about in the Festschrift. And also I've been writing about, a while back I was writing about the late 1960s. So I went back and studied that book more closely than I had before, and I agreed entirely with Richard that it's a really rich study, and he shouldn't have been so modest as to not encourage people to read what he had to say. So.
In the process of doing the conference in the volume, I'm curious what other things that you've learned about Walt or things that you already thought that were reinforced in the process of doing this, honoring him.
Well, I guess, his attachment to teaching certainly is reinforced by talking to everybody else and realizing, even beyond those of us who worked on the Festschrift, because we were all academics of one sort or another, or went into intellectual life, realizing from what I've heard today, the impact that he had on people who went into policy and people who, in a lot of regards, learned lessons from Walt that certainly weren't the ones that I took away, but by the same token, revealed the degree to which, as a teacher, he was mostly going to present things the way he saw them and try to encourage people to think for themselves. And it's clearly, people came out where they were going to come out, So that was reinforced, and the quality of him as a person. I always tell other people how years after we had finished up at Cornell, Frank Costigliola, who did his graduate work there, but I knew him then, and myself, we linked up at this seminar that for decades has gone on at the University of Connecticut. And I remember early on in going to these, I said to Frank, the only thing that I can hold against Walt is, that I thought that all academics were like him, and I've learned quite differently, and he agreed with me. And everybody agrees that, he was an exceptionally caring, open person, and that's not the way academic life is by any means. So that's certainly been something that's been reinforced again and again. And just the hospitality with which he and his wife, welcomed my wife Irene and I to their home and had dinner, and Sandy would put up with him and I talking most of the night. It was really nice. So
You mentioned some of the lessons that you took away from his mentorship, different than other people who went into different walks of life. What are the lessons that you really feel that you took away from him?
Well, I guess in part because even though I was intending to be a government major when I went to Cornell as an undergrad, it was always a debate between that and history. This graduate student I mentioned, Howard Kushner, probably tilted me in the direction of history, and once he put me in touch with Walt, and I took Walt's course, that sealed it. So I became really interested in reading a lot of history, and I read history and took a lot of history at Cornell. And in a context of trying to understand why the United States was in Vietnam, et cetera, I immediately gravitated towards explanations, and found myself increasingly convinced that the country was on a dangerously disastrous course. Walt's insistence on looking at root causes became something that interested me as well. While I find history a subject interesting in and of itself, I mean, pretty much anything that happened in the past interests me. I'm mostly interested in looking to the past to the extent that it will help me to understand the present. And, I think that the kind of, I use the term in the way Walt would have used it, a radical perspective, meaning looking at the roots of things, led me to expand my lens as to how I would look at the world. The work that I'm doing right now, if it comes to something, starts out with a chapter that puts American foreign relations in a context of a 500-year period before the narrative gets going. So, I wound up teaching courses on the history of the world, and I feel like all of that was kind of opened up by, Walt insisting that you just keep looking for what are satisfying origins or causes of things to you intellectually.
We've heard that from other people, that he was not dogmatic in terms of only knowing your one area, but that it was important to have a wide knowledge base. Was that something that you felt working with him? Yeah,
I think it's one of the reasons that he wanted me to stay at Princeton. It was to work with other people who would present different perspectives on American history. But he also knew that I was likely to rub shoulders with people in European and world history that would give me exposure to ideas that I wasn't going to get necessarily, because I'd already taken most of the people at Cornell courses with. So,
is there anything that we didn't ask that you would like us to ask, or that you want to tell us about him?
I don't think so. I think your prompts were really helpful. I did worry because if somebody had said to me, well, what did you like about Walter LaFeber, or what do you remember? I mean, the irony is that I feel like he made such an impression on me that I can almost visualize and remember every contact I ever had with him. It's like his words stayed with me because I valued, what he had to say. So that would have been really difficult if somebody just said, well, what do you remember about Walt LaFeber? So I think your prompts were extremely helpful.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.